The wind in the Montana Territory did not whisper. It roared. It was a physical thing, a solid wall of ice and noise that scoured the high plains, stripping the color from the sky and freezing the breath in a man's lungs. Thomas McAllister knew that sound. He knew the flat, metallic gray of the sky that promised a blizzard, the kind that buried fences and killed livestock. He pulled his collar tighter, the wool scratching his neck. He should have been back in the cabin hours ago. Fireplace roaring, but the cattle were spooked. They sensed the pressure drop. He'd spent the afternoon pushing the small herd into the sheltered lee of the canyon, hoping they had enough sense to stay there. Now, riding the perimeter of his land, he was checking the fences. Not that a fence mattered much to a blizzard, but it was the work that kept a man sane. His horse, a sturdy buckskin named Gideon, snorted, clouds of steam jetting from its nostrils. Thomas was riding parallel to the northern fence, the one that separated his meager ranch from Roy Haskins's sprawling one. Haskins. The name left a bitter taste in his mouth. Haskins was a man who took up too much space, whose voice was always too loud, and whose eyes always seemed to be calculating what he could take. It was the gray light, the heavy stillness before the first flakes truly began to fall. That let him see it, down by the fence line, near a drift already piling against the barbed wire, was a shape. It was dark against the white earth, unnaturally still. Thomas reined Gideon in. A coyote, maybe, caught in the wire, or a calf that had strayed from Haskins's herd. He nudged the horse closer, his eyes narrowing against the biting wind. It was not an animal. It was a bundle of dark cloth, heaped and discarded. He swung down from the saddle, his boots sinking deep into the powder. The cold hit him instantly, a sharp sting in his chest. He reached the shape and knelt. It was a person, a woman. She was lying face down, one arm flung out as if reaching for the fence post just beyond her grasp. He touched her shoulder and she felt impossibly light, almost hollow. He turned her over gently. Her face was a pale, waxy blue. Ice crystals clung to her eyelashes and her chapped, cracked lips. She was young, younger than he had expected. He saw no luggage, no blanket, only the thin, dark traveling dress she wore. It was a dress made for a train car, perhaps a parlor back east, not for the high plains of Montana in the dead of winter. It was soaked through and frozen stiff in places, offering as much protection as wet paper. He pressed 2 fingers against her neck, under the angle of her jaw. He waited, the wind howling in his ears. Nothing. He pressed harder, shifting his frozen glove. A flicker, a weak, thready pulse, as slow and sluggish as sap in winter. She was alive, barely. "Ma'am," he said, his voice loud against the wind. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered but did not open. A small, agonizing breath hitched in her chest. Thomas looked around. There was nowhere else to look. Haskins's ranch house was 2 miles north, a sprawling monument to greed. His own cabin was a mile south. The storm was closing in, the air thickening with snow. Leaving her here was a death sentence. He swore. A short, sharp sound stolen by the wind. He looped his arms under her body, one beneath her knees, one behind her shoulders, and lifted. She weighed almost nothing, a thing of twigs and frozen cloth. He carried her back to Gideon, who sidestepped nervously. It took effort to mount the horse while holding her, his muscles straining against the awkward, limp weight. He settled her sideways across his lap, her head lolling against his chest, and turned the horse for home. The mile back to the cabin was the longest of his life. The snow began in earnest, not as flakes, but as a driving, horizontal wall of white that erased the world. He rode with his head down, shielding her face as best he could with his own body. He could feel the terrifying chill of her seeping through his heavy coat. It was not the damp cold of rain. It was the deep, penetrating cold of ice, the cold that stopped the heart. He kicked the cabin door open with his boot and stumbled inside, the wind clawing at his back. He slammed it shut, plunging the small room into near darkness, the only light coming from the low, orange glow of the embers in the hearth. He laid her down on the bearskin rug before the fireplace, his breathing harsh. For a moment, he stood over her, paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of her. Then the training kicked in. The things he had learned in the war. The hard, practical knowledge of dying bodies. She was dying of hypothermia. Warmth was not enough. She needed to be warmed from the inside out. And the frozen, wet clothes were a shroud, leaching what little life she had left. He knew what this meant. He was a widower, alone for 6 years, bringing an unknown woman into his house, even a dying one, was scandal. Undressing her, even to save her, was ruin. If she lived, her reputation would be gone. If she died, they might call it murder. He looked at her blue-tinted face. He did not have a choice. "God forgive me," he muttered, and knelt beside her. His fingers were numb, clumsy with the cold in his thick gloves. He pulled them off, tossing them aside. He worked quickly, his jaw set. Her dress was frozen stiff. The buttons were impossible, tiny pearls encased in ice. He went to his saddlebags, retrieved his hunting knife, and returned to her. It was a hard, necessary thing. He cut the laces of her bodice, the frozen fabric resisting the blade. He cut the dress open, pulling the stiff, damp wool away from her skin. Underneath, she wore a corset and layers of linen, all of it cold and wet. He cut those, too, his blade slicing through laces and ribbons. He averted his eyes as much as possible, driven not by modesty but by the sheer, awful pity of it. Her skin was mottled blue and white. She was thin, her ribs visible beneath her flesh. He worked until she was free of the freezing clothes. Then he dragged his own cot mattress closer to the hearth and rolled her onto it. He piled every blanket he owned on top of her. He stoked the fire, adding logs until it roared, the heat blasting the small room. He filled the kettle and set it on the hob, then rubbed her hands and feet, trying to force circulation back into the waxy, white extremities. Her feet were bad. The toes were hard, a pale, yellowish gray, frostbite, serious frostbite. He worked for an hour, rubbing her limbs, forcing spoonfuls of lukewarm water mixed with a little whiskey between her lips when she showed the faintest sign of swallowing. He did not stop, driven by a grim, focused energy. She woke near midnight. He was sitting in his chair, staring into the flames, when a sound ripped through the quiet. It was a sharp, terrified gasp. He turned. She was sitting bolt upright on the mattress, the blankets pooled around her waist. Her eyes were wide, dark pits of terror in her pale face. She saw him, and she screamed. It was a thin, dry sound, full of horror. "Easy, ma'am," Thomas said, holding his hands up, palms out. "You're safe. You were freezing. I found you by the fence line." She scrambled backward, dragging the blankets with her, until her back hit the rough-hewn logs of the cabin wall. Her eyes darted around the small, masculine room, the gun rack, the saddle in the corner, the single cot, and him. "Where am I?" she whispered. Her voice was a dry rasp. "This is my ranch. You're in the Montana Territory. You collapsed in the snow? There's a blizzard. You've been here for about 6 hours." Her breathing was coming in short, panicked pants, her gaze fixed on the pile of her wet, cut-apart clothing steaming near the hearth. The realization of her nakedness beneath the blankets hit her, and a fresh wave of terror crossed her face. She pulled the blankets up to her chin, her knuckles white. Her hand, which had been clutching the blankets, suddenly tightened on something else. She had been holding it. It seemed, even in her frozen state, it was a damp, creased piece of paper. A letter. She held it up as if it were a shield. Thomas could read the bold script from across the room. It was from a land office, but the scrawled writing beneath it was what mattered. Guaranteed marriage, the letter had proclaimed. He was supposed to be there. She whispered, her teeth chattering. "He promised. He sent the ticket." "Who, ma'am?" Thomas asked, his voice gentle. She looked at the letter, then at him, her eyes clouded with confusion and betrayal. "Mr. Roy Haskins. He wrote that he would meet the stage in town. I waited all day. He never came. A cold knot tightened in Thomas's gut. Roy Haskins, his neighbor, a man known for his cruelty, his heavy hand, and his utter lack of honor. He had ordered a bride by post and let her freeze to death 7 miles from town, just yards from his own fence line. "Haskins is my neighbor," Thomas said, his voice flat. "You were on the edge of his property when I found you." The woman stared at him, the full meaning of his words settling over her. She had walked from town 7 miles in a parlor dress as the worst storm of the season closed in, all because the man who had promised her a new life had not bothered to show up. She didn't cry. She just closed her eyes, and the last bit of fight seemed to drain out of her, leaving her huddled against the wall, a picture of absolute desolation. She had left Pennsylvania because staying was worse. Her name was Clara. She had not spoken it aloud in weeks, not since she'd bought the train ticket with the last of her mother's money. Her father, a man hollowed out by drink and failure after the foundry closed, had watched her pack. He had not objected. He had looked at her as just another mouth, another burden. He was the one who had seen the advertisement in the newspaper. Men of property in the West seek decent, Christian wives. Clara had seen it too, but she had also seen the small, unmarked grave she had dug herself behind the tannery 2 winters before. A baby boy, born silent in the cold attic room. A secret that had nearly cost her her life. The man responsible, the foreman at the mill, had laughed when she told him, Montana. It was a word that meant distance. It meant a place where no one knew her name, her shame, or the hardness of her father's hand. Roy Haskins's letters had been brief, functional. He owned 4,000 acres. He needed a wife to keep house. He promised stability. He had sent $30 for the ticket. A good price, her father had said, pocketing the change. The journey had been a blur of smoke, rattling steel, an endless flat land. The train gave way to a cramped, jarring stagecoach. She had held the letter in her hand the entire time. Guaranteed marriage. It sounded so solid, so safe. She arrived in the small, muddy frontier town with one small valise and the clothes on her back. She stepped down from the stage, expecting to see a man, any man. The street was nearly empty. A few cowboys watched her from the saloon porch, their eyes lingering. The liveryman just grunted and pointed her toward the general store. She sat on a bench inside the store for hours, the proprietor eyeing her with suspicion. She waited. Noon came and went. The sky turned that sick, gray color. "You waiting on someone, miss?" the proprietor finally asked. "Mr. Roy Haskins," she said, her voice small. The man's expression hardened. He looked at the window, then back at her. "Well, he ain't here, and that storm's rolling in fast. You best find a room at the hotel. Haskins' place is 7 miles north." She had no money for a hotel. The ticket had taken everything. Shame, hot and sharp, burned in her throat. She could not stay here. She could not be a charity case in a town that already judged her. I will walk," she said, clutching her valise. "That's suicide, miss," the man said, turning back to his counter. But she was stubborn, and she was terrified. She thought if she could just get there, if she could just show him she was useful, it would be all right. She left the valise at the store and started walking. The first 2 miles were just cold. The 3rd mile, the wind picked up, tearing at her thin dress. By the 4th mile, the snow had begun, and she could no longer feel her feet. The cold was a thief. It stole the hope from her first, then her strength, then it stole her direction. She wandered off the track, following what she thought was a fence. She fell. She got up. She fell again. She remembered thinking only of the small, silent baby she had buried. She thought, maybe I will see him now. Then she fell one last time, the letter still clutched in her frozen hand, and the world went dark. Back in the cabin, the blizzard raged. The sound was immense, a constant, high-pitched scream that vibrated in the logs. Thomas looked at the woman, Clara, curled up by the fire. "You can't go anywhere," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "That storm has shut us in. It could be 3 days. It could be a week. You need to heal. Your feet are bad." She looked up, her eyes wary. She was trapped again. Trapped with a different man. In a different cabin. You will not. I will not harm you, Thomas said, cutting her off. He understood her fear. He was a stranger. I am not Roy Haskins. You are safe here. I give you my word. She stared at him, searching his face. He was an older man, maybe 40. His face was weathered, carved by sun and wind. There were deep lines around his eyes. They were not cruel eyes, she decided. They were just tired. She nodded, a small, jerky movement. She would stay. She had no choice. The next days blurred into a gray twilight of pain and fever. The storm did not let up. The world shrank to the four walls of the cabin. Clara's frostbite turned serious. The skin on her feet and 3 fingers on her left hand blistered, turned black. The pain was excruciating, a constant, burning throb that made her sick. Thomas tended to her with a grim, quiet efficiency. He never slept, or so it seemed. He spent the sleepless nights changing poultices of snow and herbs, cleaning the wounds, and forcing broth between her lips. He slept in the chair, waking every hour to check the fire and her fever. They barely spoke. The cabin was too small for conversation. It was filled with the sound of the wind, the crackle of the fire, and the small sounds of her pain. But a strange intimacy grew in the silence. It was the intimacy of the sick room, a closeness born of necessity, not choice. He saw her at her worst, delirious with fever, weeping in pain. She saw him weary, his shoulders slumped, his face rough with stubble. He knew the color of her eyes, a deep, uncertain brown. She knew the sound of his breathing in the dark, the snow piled high, covering the windows, burying them. On the 3rd night, the fever broke. Clara woke, her mind clear for the first time, the pain in her feet a dull, heavy ache. Thomas was asleep in the chair, his head tilted back, his mouth slightly open. She watched him for a long time. He had saved her life. He had tended her wounds, fed her, and asked for nothing. He had not touched her, not once, beyond the necessary care. The silence felt different now. It felt heavy. "The snow is deep," she whispered. His eyes opened instantly. He was a man who did not sleep soundly. "Aye, it is. How long have I been here?" 4 days, he said. She absorbed this. 4 days. Trapped with him? She looked down at the blankets, at her bandaged feet. "My father, he sold me, said the $30 for the ticket was a good price." The words came out of nowhere, surprising even her. It was the fever breaking, the pressure releasing. Thomas just nodded, feeding another log into the fire. He did not act surprised. He did not pity her. He just listened. "I had a baby once," she said, her voice barely audible over the wind. "A boy. He didn't even cry. I buried him myself." She had never told anyone, not a living soul. She did not know why she told this quiet, weathered stranger. Maybe because the storm was so loud. It felt like the world couldn't hear. Thomas sat back down. He stared into the fire for a long time, the orange light playing over the harsh lines of his face. "I had a wife," he said, his voice rough. "Sarah. She died right here, on this floor." Clara watched him. "The snow was this bad," he continued, his voice low. 10 years ago. She was in labor. The doctor couldn't get through. I tried. I did everything I knew. But the baby, he wouldn't turn." He paused, swallowing. "She bled. I couldn't stop it. She died before the baby was even born. I had to take him from her." His hands, resting on his knees, clenched into fists. "He was a boy, too. I held my son for maybe an hour before he went cold. Too, I buried them both out on the ridge when the thaw came." He fell silent. Clara could hear the guilt in his voice, a heavy old stone he had been carrying for a decade. "I never remarried," he said, as if to himself. "I came back from the war, from Shiloh and Vicksburg, thinking I'd seen the worst of it, thinking I knew what killing was. I came back here hoping the quiet would wash it out. It doesn't. This house, it's been quiet for a long time." They sat in the shared darkness, two people defined by the children they had lost, by the betrayals of the body and the failures of men. The blizzard intensified that night. It was as if the world was trying to break into the small cabin. The wind shrieked, and the temperature dropped so low the logs of the cabin groaned. The fire was dying. Thomas had been feeding it, but the cold was relentless. It was no longer just outside. It was inside, creeping from the floorboards, flowing like water through the smallest cracks. Clara was shaking. Despite the mountain of blankets, she could not get warm. The fever was gone, but in its place was a deep, agonizing chill that settled in her bones. Her teeth chattered so hard she thought they might break. Thomas piled his own heavy coat on top of her. It did no good. She was too thin, her body lacking the strength to generate its own heat. "I can't," she stuttered, her whole body convulsing with shivers. "I'm so cold." Thomas looked at her, his face grim. He knew this stage. It was the stage that came after the fever, the one where the body gave up. He looked at the fire, then at his cot, then at her. He made a decision. Clara watched him through blurry, tear-filled eyes as he unlaced his boots and kicked them off. He removed his gun belt and hung it on the peg. He stood by her mattress, hesitating for only a second. She thought he meant to harm her. She flinched, a small, broken sound in her throat. "I am not Haskins," he said, his voice harsh, almost angry. "But you are freezing to death. We share the heat, or you die. It is that simple." He lifted the edge of the blankets. The blast of cold air that hit his chest made him gasp. He slid onto the mattress, keeping his back to her, creating a solid wall of his own warmth. "Turn around," he ordered. She hesitated, terrified. "Turn around. Clara, put your back to mine. It's the only way." Slowly, trembling, she rolled onto her side, pressing her back against his. His body was solid, a furnace against her ice-cold skin. She gasped at the shock of the heat. They lay like that for an hour, rigid, not speaking, their backs pressed together, but the cold was still winning. She was still shivering. "This ain't working," he said, his voice a low rumble. Before she could protest, he moved. He turned, pulling her with him, arranging her so her back was pressed against his chest. He was like a larger shell, fitting himself around her. He pulled her bandaged feet up, tucking them against his own legs, and wrapped his arms around her middle, pulling the blankets tight around them both. She was rigid with fear. She could feel his heart beating against her spine. His breath was warm on the back of her neck. "I am just trying to keep you alive," he whispered, his voice rough with exhaustion. "Do not think of it as anything else." She forced herself to relax. She let his warmth seep into her. He was right. It was not desire. It was survival. It was the simple, animal need for heat. They lay there in the aching silence. It was the most crowded silence Thomas had ever known. It was the sound of two people surviving, and nothing more. She was a stranger, but he knew the rhythm of her breathing, the sharp bones of her spine, the smell of the herbs on her bandages. Slowly, the violent shivering subsided. Her breathing deepened, becoming regular. She had fallen asleep, her body finally succumbing to the warmth. Thomas stayed awake. He lay in the dark, holding this broken woman, listening to the storm try to tear their shelter apart. Outside, the wind screamed, and somewhere in the white, a wolf pack howled, a hungry, lonely sound. Inside the cabin, the embers in the hearth glowed a dull, stubborn red, a single spark, refusing to die in the overwhelming cold. The blizzard broke on the 9th day. The wind died first, leaving an abrupt, heavy silence that felt louder than the storm itself. When Thomas opened the cabin door, the world was gone, buried under a sea of white so bright it hurt the eyes. The snow was piled in drifts as high as the roof, a clean, brutal, and beautiful tomb. It took him 2 days to dig a path to the woodpile and another to the barn, where the cattle huddled, lowing in hunger. Clara remained inside. Her feet were healing, the blackness receding, leaving behind raw, tender skin. But she was weak, and the cold was still a danger. She did not, however, stay idle. The day Thomas cleared the windows, letting the sharp, blue-white light flood the cabin. It was as if a switch had been thrown. She got up from the mattress. She could not wear her own clothes, which were ruined, or her shoes, which were frozen, solid, and useless. Thomas had given her a pair of his old wool trousers, which she had to roll up 6 times at the cuff, and one of his flannel shirts, the sleeves so long they hung past her hands. She cinched the trousers with a length of rope, barefoot, limping heavily. She began to move. She started with the cooking. She took the sack of beans and the salt pork and, without a word, made a stew that was thicker and richer than anything Thomas had bothered to make for himself in years. She scoured his cast-iron skillet with salt until it shone. A new rhythm settled over the small cabin. It was a rhythm of 2. He would be out for hours, checking his fences, digging out his spring house. He would return, half frozen and exhausted, to find the cabin warm, the floor swept, and coffee bubbling on the hearth. She would be sitting by the fire, mending. Her hands, still raw, were clumsy with the needle, but she repaired his socks, stitched a tear in his coat, and hemmed her borrowed trousers with tiny, meticulous stitches. They grew comfortable. The silence between them changed. It was no longer the desperate, charged silence of survival, nor the awkward silence of strangers. It was a quiet, domestic thing. They began to talk, but never about the night she had slept in his arms. They spoke of small things. He told her how to tell a storm sky from a snow sky. She told him about the forests in Pennsylvania, how the trees grew so thick you could not see the sun. He spoke of his horse, Gideon. She spoke of a pear tree she had loved as a child. They never spoke of her past, or his, the 2 great defining griefs they had shared in the dark. Her lost child, his lost wife and son, remained where they had left them, buried deep beneath the snow of that first night. But the unspoken was always there. It was in the way he handed her a cup of coffee, his fingers careful not to brush hers. It was in the way she folded his blankets in the morning, a task that was not hers, but which she claimed. Thomas found himself watching her. He saw her not as the half-dead creature he had pulled from the snow, or as Haskins's discarded property. He saw a woman who was quiet but not weak. He saw the stubborn set of her jaw as she scrubbed the floorboards, the concentration in her eyes as she learned to bank the fire. He began to see her as someone who, like him, understood the texture of loss. She knew what it was to be lonely, to be disappointed by life, and to keep breathing anyway. One afternoon, he was out checking a trap line, hoping for a rabbit. The cabin was quiet, and Clara felt a restless energy. She had cleaned everything she could clean. Needing to move, she began to sweep the packed dirt floor near his cot. The broom caught on something. She knelt, lifting the edge of the mattress. Tucked deep against the log wall was a small, dark wooden box. It was not a chest, it was small, something a person could hold in 2 hands. It was carved on the lid with a simple pattern of vines. She pulled it out. The wood was smooth. It was not locked. She ran a finger over the carving, her heart thumping. This was his, this was hers, Sarah's, the wife who had died on this floor. Clara's fingers went to the small brass latch. She could open it. She could see the face of the woman he had loved. See the ribbons, the letters, the ghosts. It was a powerful, human temptation. She thought of her own past, a thing she wanted to burn. She thought of the few, meager possessions she had left at the general store, a valise holding nothing of value. This box was all that was left of a life. Her hand dropped from the latch. She pushed the box back, sliding it deep under the cot, farther than she had found it. She covered it with the blanket, smoothing the edge. She rose and went back to the hearth, her hands shaking slightly. When Thomas returned, he brought 2 rabbits. He stopped just inside the door, stamping the snow from his boots. He glanced at his cot. He could see the faint sweep marks in the dirt, the different way the blanket lay. He looked at Clara, who was kneading dough for biscuits, her back to him. I was sweeping, she said, her voice small. She did not turn around. I found a box. I put it back. Thomas hung his coat on the peg. He said nothing for a long moment. He walked to the cot, bent down, and pulled the box out. He held it, his expression unreadable. That was Sarah's, he said. His voice was rough. He did not open it. He just held it, then placed it on the high shelf above the fireplace. A place of honor, a place out of reach. He turned back to her. He did not thank her, but his eyes were clear, and the tightness around his mouth had eased. He respected her. In that moment, he knew she was not a taker. She understood. The thaw came, and with it, the truth of their situation. They were running out of flour. The coffee was gone. The laudanum he had used on her feet was almost empty, and her wounds, while healing, still needed proper bandages. We have to go to town, he said one morning. Clara froze. Town, the place she had walked from, the place where Haskins lived. I can stay, she offered, her voice tight. You can go. And what will people say then? Thomas asked, pulling on his boots. That I'm keeping you prisoner? It's better to face it. We need supplies. He looked at her, his gaze softening. It will be difficult. I cannot hide here forever, she said, her voice gaining strength. He had helped her patch her dark traveling dress. It was the only thing she had. He gave her a pair of his own wool socks and his old winter boots. They were far too large, but she stuffed the toes with rags until she could walk in them. She braided her hair tightly, and for the first time, Thomas saw the strong, fine line of her jaw. The ride was 8 miles, the wagon wheels sinking in the thick, wet slush. The world was a mess of melting snow and dark, muddy earth. The brightness was gone, leaving a gray, hard reality. The town of Three Forks was one muddy main street, lined with false-fronted buildings. As they pulled up to the general store, Thomas saw heads turn. The liveryman stopped, mid-swing with his hammer. 2 cowboys on the saloon porch stopped talking and watched, their eyes lingering on Clara. Thomas helped her down from the wagon. Her hand was small in his, and he felt a tremor run through it. He let go as soon as she was steady. He put his hand on the small of her back and guided her onto the boardwalk. Mrs. Davies, the preacher's wife, was walking toward them. She saw them. Her eyes widened in shock, and she abruptly crossed the muddy street to avoid them. Clara flinched as if struck. Thomas's jaw tightened. They entered the general store. The warmth and the smell of coffee, tobacco, and dried apples hit them. The store was crowded, and it went absolutely silent. Silas Croft, the proprietor, was weighing sugar for a customer. He stopped, the scoop hovering. Every eye in the store, ranchers, wives, prospectors, turned to them, to Thomas, and then to the woman beside him, the woman in the mended dress and the oversized men's boots. Thomas ignored them. He walked to the counter, Clara a step behind him. Silas, Thomas said, his voice calm. I need 20 pounds of flour, coffee, salt, and a bottle of laudanum, and a roll of proper bandages. Silas Croft set the scoop down. He was a thin man, a deacon at the church. He looked past Thomas, his gaze landing on Clara with open disapproval. I can sell to you, Thomas, Silas said, his voice flat and loud in the silent room. You're good for it, but I won't serve her. She is with me, Thomas said. The words were quiet, but they carried the weight of a dropped stone. That's the talk, all right, a man by the pickle barrel muttered. Living in sin, a woman whispered to another, her voice sharp. With another man's intended. She's a harlot, the first woman replied, loud enough for Clara to hear. Roy Haskins was right to leave her out, probably diseased. Clara stood rigid, her face chalk white. She looked at the floorboards. Her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. Give me my supplies. Silas, Thomas said. He took a leather pouch from his pocket and dropped it on the counter. The clink of coin was sharp. Silas looked at the pouch, then at Thomas, then at Clara. He sighed, annoyed, and turned to get the flour. The store door banged open, crashing against the wall. Roy Haskins stood there. He was a large man, built to fill doorways. He wore an expensive fur coat and a look of pure menace. He was flanked by two of his hired hands. He was drunk. He scanned the room, and his eyes locked on Clara. A slow, ugly smile spread across his florid face. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice booming. He sauntered in, his men staying by the door. The other customers melted away, clearing a space. "Look what the buzzards dragged in. I thought you'd be frozen solid by now, you little bitch." Clara shrank back, a small, involuntary sound escaping her. Thomas moved, planting himself squarely between her and Haskins. "She's not your concern. Roy." "Not my concern?" Haskins laughed, a wet, harsh sound. "I paid $30 good for that one. She's my property, stolen property, by the looks of it." His piggish eyes raked over Clara. "And look at her, dressed in your clothes. McAllister, been keeping her warm. Have you?" He turned his full attention to Thomas. "Always playing the saint, ain't you? The quiet, grieving widower. Turns out you're just a common thief, a rutting dog, taking what's mine." "She's a woman, not a parcel," Thomas said, his voice dangerously low. His hands were clenched at his sides. "You left her to die. She was late," Haskins bellowed, spittle flying. "I don't wait on no one, especially not some scrawny Eastern whore who can't even tell time. She probably got lost trying to find the saloon." He jabbed a thick finger toward Clara. "You're a liar, a thief. You stole my $30. You owe me." "I owed you nothing," Clara said. Her voice was a thin thread, but it was clear and sharp. She stepped out from behind Thomas, her eyes blazing. "The agreement was for you to meet the stage. You broke it. You left me." Haskins's face purpled with rage. "You shut your mouth, girl, before I shut it for you." He took a heavy step toward her. Thomas shoved him. It was a hard, solid push to the chest. "That's enough." Haskins stumbled back, surprised by Thomas's strength. He looked at Thomas, his eyes narrowed to slits. He saw Thomas's fists. He looked at Clara, standing defiant and pale right behind Thomas. He sneered. Then, with deliberate, hateful slowness, he turned his head and spat. A thick wad of tobacco and saliva flew through the air. It landed on the hem of Clara's mended dress. The world stopped. Clara looked down at the stain, her face crumbling. Thomas did not think. He did not plan. The years of quiet, the grief for Sarah, the shame of the war, the fury at the injustice, and the deep, protective ache he felt for the woman behind him. It all detonated. He hit Roy Haskins with a single, brutal right cross. The sound of knuckles connecting with jawbone was like a pistol shot in the small store. It was not a barroom brawl. It was a precise, violent, and finishing blow. Haskins's head snapped back. His eyes rolled. He stumbled backward, collapsing over a barrel of crackers and crashing to the floor in a heap. He lay there, dazed and groaning. Thomas stood over him, breathing hard, his fist raised. His knuckles were split and bleeding. The store was utterly silent. No one moved. Thomas slowly lowered his hand. He looked at Silas Croft, who was frozen behind the counter. "You," Thomas said, his voice a rasp. "Finish bagging my supplies." He pointed at Haskins. "Stay away from her. Stay away from my land. If you come near her again, I will finish it." He grabbed the heavy sack of flour with one hand, the smaller bag of supplies with the other. He turned to Clara, who was staring at him, her eyes wide with shock. He jerked his head toward the door. "We're leaving." He strode out of the store, Clara half running to keep up. He left the entire town in stunned, terrified silence. The 8-mile ride back to the ranch was a new kind of silent. It was a vibrating, electric thing. Thomas's knuckles dripped blood onto the wagon boards. His jaw was set so hard a muscle jumped in his cheek. Clara sat beside him, staring straight ahead, her face a mask of pale porcelain. She did not look at him. She did not look at the stain on her dress. They reached the cabin. Thomas pulled the wagon to a stop, jumped down, and began unhitching Gideon with stiff, angry movements. He worked without looking at her. Clara slid down from the wagon seat and hurried inside, slamming the door. When Thomas entered the cabin minutes later, carrying the supplies, she was standing by the cold hearth, her back to him, her shoulders rigid. He dropped the sacks on the table. He went to the wash basin, pumped water, and plunged his bleeding hand into the icy basin. The water instantly clouded pink. He heard a sound, a sharp, choked gasp, as if she were strangling. He spun around. She was crying, but it was not the quiet, fevered weeping he had heard before. She was sobbing. Great, body-racking sobs that shook her from head to foot. Her hands were clamped over her mouth as if to hold the sound in. "Clara?" he said, alarmed, taking a step toward her. "Did he hurt you? Did I miss—" She shook her head, her hands falling away. Tears streamed down her face. "No," she gasped. "No, it's just—" She looked at him, her face a wreck of confusion and gratitude. "No one," she whispered, her voice breaking. "No one has ever done that. For me, not ever. They just watched." Her father, the foreman, the men on the street, they had all just watched. He realized she was not crying from fear. She was crying from the raw, stunning shock of being defended, the realization that she was worth the fight, worth the scandal, worth his bloodied hand. The anger drained out of Thomas, washed away by a sudden, powerful tide of tenderness that ached in his chest. He stood there for a second, his hand dripping, lost. Then he crossed the room in 2 strides. He didn't know what else to do. He pulled her against his chest, his arms wrapped around her, pulling her in tight. She buried her face in the rough wool of his shirt, her hands grabbing his coat, and she wept. He held her, his large hand coming up to cup the back of her head, his chin resting on her hair. He just held her, solid as an oak, letting her cry out all the years of being undefended. She felt impossibly small in his arms. He could feel the sharp line of her spine, the frantic beat of her heart against his ribs. Gradually, her sobs quieted. She was still clinging to him, her breathing ragged. She did not pull away. Slowly, she tilted her head back, looking up at him. Her face was wet, her eyes red and luminous. Her lips were parted, trembling. He looked down at her. The cabin was silent save for their breathing. The smell of her hair, clean and smelling faintly of wood smoke, filled his senses. He saw her, not the victim, not the burden, not the stranger, just Clara. He lowered his head. She saw him coming. She rose on her toes, her eyes fluttering shut, her hand moving from his coat to his chest. Their lips were a fraction of an inch from touching. He could feel the warm, damp puff of her breath. She could feel the heat radiating from his skin. The air in the cabin was too thick, too heavy. A log in the hearth, cooling, shifted and fell with a soft thud. The sound shattered the moment. They both pulled back at once, as if waking from a dream. They sprang apart, breathless and stunned. Clara turned away, her hand flying to her mouth. She was blushing, a deep, painful red. I should— Your hand," she stammered. "It needs tending." "Aye," Thomas said. His voice was a hoarse croak. He turned back to the wash basin, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. That night, supper was a tense, quiet affair. She cleaned his knuckles and wrapped them properly with the new bandages. Her touch was light, almost clinical, but every place her fingers brushed his skin, it burned. Later, the tension was unbearable. He sat by the fire, oiling his rifle, the familiar motions usually a comfort. Tonight, his hands felt clumsy. She was sitting on her mattress, her back to him, staring at the cabin wall. "You should not have done that," she said, her voice quiet. "In town, with Mr. Haskins. It will only make things harder for you. They all think I am your whore now." "He had no right to touch you," Thomas said, his hand stilling on the rifle. "No man has that right." She was quiet for a long time. "The way they looked at me, the men in the store, even Mr. Croft, they look at me Like I am a thing, a piece of meat to be looked at, judged, used. She turned, her braid falling over her shoulder. Her face was pale in the firelight, her eyes searching his. But you do not. Thomas stopped his work. He set the rifle down. He looked at her, truly looked at her, sitting there in his shirt. She looked small, but her gaze was steady. Why? She asked, her voice a whisper. After all this, after you found me, after you cut my clothes from me, after that night in the storm. Why don't you look at me like that? It was a question that demanded the truth. Thomas thought of all the things he had seen, the things men did in war, the things Haskins did in peace. He thought of his dead wife, Sarah, and the gentle respect they had shared. Because, he said, his voice low and steady, I don't want to take what you haven't chosen to give. The words hung in the small, warm room. They were the truest words he had spoken in a decade. Clara stared at him. She saw the honesty in his tired eyes. He was not Haskins. He was not her father. He was not any man she had ever known. He had given her safety, and he had not asked for a single thing in return. Her lips parted. She whispered, And if I choose? The question was a live thing, a spark leaping from the fire, landing in the space between them. Thomas's heart stopped, then hammered in his chest. He did not know how to answer. He did not know if he wanted her to choose him. The town was already against them. This was a road to ruin. But she did not wait for an answer. The weight of her own words seemed to scare her. She looked down at her hands, then stood up from the mattress. He tensed, watching her. She walked across the room to him. He stayed seated, looking up at her. She did not lean down to kiss him. She did not touch his face. She just reached out and rested her hand on his. The one that was not bandaged, the one resting on his knee. Her fingers were cool, her touch light. Her hand lingered there. 1 second, 2. It was a gesture of profound, silent understanding. It was gratitude. It was a question. It was, perhaps, an answer. Then, just as quietly, she withdrew her hand. She turned and walked back to her mattress. She slipped under the blankets and turned her back to him, facing the wall. Thomas sat by the fire for hours, long after the logs had burned to embers. He could still feel the phantom press of her fingers on his hand. He wanted her. The realization hit him with the force of his own punch. He wanted her with a sharp, aching loneliness that frightened him. He wanted to protect her, yes, but he also wanted to pull her back into his arms. He wanted to finish what they had nearly started. He wanted to feel her breath on his skin, to forget the cold, the war, and the silence. But he held himself still. He looked at her sleeping form, a small shape in the darkness. He knew that line. He had lived on this frontier long enough to see it. The line between protection and possession was as thin as a razor, and a man could cross it without even knowing, becoming the very thing he swore he would never be. He was fighting a war with himself, in the quiet of his own cabin, and he was terrified he was going to lose. The morning after her question, "And if I choose?" The air in the cabin was so thick it was difficult to breathe. The quiet intimacy of their shared survival was gone, replaced by a sharp, vibrating awareness. Thomas woke from his chair, his neck stiff, to find her already awake on her mattress, her eyes on him. Neither of them spoke of the night before, of the town, or of her hand on his. The silence was a new kind of wall, one made of unspoken desire and profound fear. He left the cabin before the sun was fully up, needing the bite of the cold air, needing the hard, mindless work of his chores to clear his head. He chopped wood for 3 hours, not stopping until his hands were raw and his shirt was damp with sweat. The image of her face in the firelight burned into his mind. He was a man drowning in a promise he had made both to her and to himself. When he returned, she was not by the fire. She was outside, by the wood pile, wearing his oversized boots and coat. She was trying to lift his axe. It was far too heavy, and she stumbled, her thin arms straining. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. She dropped the axe, her face flushing with frustration. "I am working. That's my work. You're not healed. I am healed enough," she said, her chin jutting out. "I will not be a burden, Mr. McAllister. I will not be a guest. If I am to stay here, I will earn my keep, or I will leave." He looked at her, really looked at her. She meant it. This was not a plea. It was a statement. The woman he had pulled from the snow was gone. This woman was made of something tougher. He knew that to argue would be to insult her. "The axe is too heavy for you," he said, his voice softening. "You'll split your own foot if you mean to cut wood. You use the buck saw, and you start with the smaller limbs." She nodded, her eyes fierce. "Then show me." So he showed her. He showed her how to brace the wood, how to use her body weight on the saw, how to stack the wood so it would dry. He showed her how to muck the stalls in the small barn, how to check the cattle for hoof rot, how to scatter grain for the few chickens that had survived the winter. She worked. She worked until her hands, already raw from the frostbite, blistered and bled. She limped, her feet still tender, but she did not complain. She just wrapped them in fresh rags and kept moving. A new routine settled, one of shared labor. They were a team, moving around the small ranch, speaking not in the charged whispers of the night but in the practical language of the frontier. "The fence is down by the creek. The flour is low. That gray hen hasn't laid in 2 days." And in that work, the tension eased. The charged awareness was still there, but it was buried beneath the comfortable exhaustion of a day's labor. He began to see the strength in her, not just the sorrow. She was clever. She learned quickly. "You cannot stay on this ranch and not know how to ride," he told her one morning. The spring sun finally strong enough to melt the last of the deep drifts. "I have never been on a horse," she said, her eyes wary. "It is time you learned." He did not put her on Gideon, who was too much horse, too full of fire. He saddled the gentler bay mare, June, who he used as a pack animal. He showed Clara how to check the cinch, how to hold the reins. "Now, up," he said. She looked at the stirrup, then at him. I cannot," he sighed, though not in annoyance. He cupped his hands. "Put your foot here." She did, and with one strong, easy motion, he lifted her, his hands spanning her waist. She gasped as she landed in the saddle. She was high off the ground, unsteady. He felt the tremor run through her. His hands lingered at her waist for a second longer than necessary. He could feel the lean, strong line of her ribs through the wool shirt. He pulled his hands away as if burned. He led the horse around the corral, his hand on the bridle, talking in a low, steady voice. "Feel the horse. Move with her. She can feel you. If you're scared, she'll be scared." He taught her for an hour, then another. By the end of the week, she was trotting June around the corral on her own. One afternoon, she took a corner too fast. The mare shied, and Clara, losing her balance, let out a small shriek, grabbing for the saddle horn. Thomas, who had been mending a bridle, leaped over the fence, thinking she would fall, but she righted herself, pulling the mare to a halt, her face pale. Then, a sound he had never heard before, a small, bubbling chuckle. It grew, and she threw her head back and laughed. It was a real, unguarded laugh, full of relief and the simple joy of staying on. Thomas stopped, his heart aching. The sound transformed her. It wiped the shadows from her face, made her eyes bright. He found himself smiling, a real smile that reached his eyes, one he had not felt in years. "You did well," he said. Her laughter faded as she looked at him, their gazes locking. The shared joy was as intimate as a touch. The next lesson was more serious. He took his rifle from the cabin wall. "I do not want to learn that," she said, her voice flat. "This is not Pennsylvania," he said, his voice firm. "You ride out, you ride armed. Haskins is still out there, and there are wolves, and men who are worse than both. This is not a choice. Clara, this is survival." He took her to the edge of the canyon and set up a row of tin cans on a log. The rifle was heavy in her arms. She struggled to hold it steady. He stepped behind her. "You are holding it wrong. You'll break your shoulder." He put his body flush against her back. His left arm came around her, his hand covering hers on the forestock. His right arm came around her other side, his hand settling over hers on the trigger guard. She was enveloped by him. She stopped breathing. She could feel the solid wall of his chest against her spine. His chin was inches from her hair, and she could smell the faint, clean scent of soap and worn leather. "Breathe," he whispered, his voice a low rumble in her ear. "Let your breath out. Squeeze the trigger. Do not pull it." His finger put pressure on hers. The explosion of the rifle was deafening, shocking. The recoil slammed the rifle butt back, but it hit his shoulder. Not hers. He absorbed the shock. His body a shield. The tin can did not move. "Again?" he said. They stood like that for He felt her take a breath and let it out. Her body relaxed, melting back against his. She squeezed. The rifle bucked. The can flew off the log, spinning into the air. She let out a sharp gasp of surprise. He loosened his grip, stepping back. The sudden absence of his warmth left her cold. She turned to him, her face flushed with a mixture of fear and pride. "I did it." "Yes," he said, his voice thick. "You did." Their connection was no longer just about survival. It was built in the shared sweat of labor, the quiet understanding of teaching and learning. It was in the bread she baked, in the fence posts he set, in the laughter she had found, and in the way his body had shielded hers. The line between them was blurring. He was no longer just her savior, and she was no longer just his ward. They were a man and a woman, living in a space too small for the feelings growing between them. The breaking point came with a late spring snow. It was a sudden, treacherous squall that blew in from the north one evening while they were securing the barn. They had just finished feeding the livestock when the wind hit, a sudden, violent roar. The air turned white. "We must get to the cabin!" Clara shouted over the noise. Thomas pulled the barn door shut, the wood groaning. He looked out the small, dirty window. He could not see the cabin, 50 yards away. "We cannot!" he yelled back. "It is a whiteout. We would be lost in seconds. We waited out here." The barn was cold, the wind finding every crack in the walls, whistling through the empty stalls. They climbed the ladder to the hayloft, digging deep into the dry hay for warmth. It was not enough. The cold was a living thing, seeping into their bones. They shivered, huddled side by side, the roar of the wind insulating them from the world. "This is where we will be found," Clara said, her voice small, her teeth chattering. "Frozen, like I was." "We will not freeze," Thomas said. He grabbed a heavy, stiff horse blanket from a peg and threw it over both of them. He pulled her closer. "We share the warmth, like before." This time, she did not hesitate. She pressed against his side, burrowing under his arm. They sat in the hay, wrapped in the musty wool, listening to the storm. "I was always cold back east," she whispered into the darkness. "Even in summer, my father, he sold my mother's shawl for drink. I remember sitting by a cold stove, just aching." He said nothing, just pulled the blanket tighter. His arm was a solid, warm bar around her shoulders. She turned her head, her face buried in his coat. She felt the steady, slow beat of his heart under her cheek. He was so solid, so safe. She had a sudden, overwhelming urge to thank him, not with words, but with the only thing she truly owned. She lifted her head. He looked down at her. His face was shadows in the dark, but she could feel the intensity of his gaze. Slowly, tentatively, she leaned in. She was aiming for his cheek, a gesture of gratitude, but in the dark, she missed. Her lips, chapped and cold, brushed the rough, warm skin of his neck, just below his jaw. He froze. His entire body went rigid. A low sound, almost a groan, rumbled in his chest. She did not pull away. The contact was electric. She felt the pulse quicken in his throat. Emboldened, driven by a desperate need to feel something other than cold, she pressed her mouth there, a soft, warm, and deliberate kiss. He inhaled sharply, as if struck. His hand, which was on her shoulder, tightened, his fingers digging in, He turned his head. His mouth found hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a collision. It was all the unspoken words, all the tension, all the loneliness of the past months. It was 6 years of solitude for him and a lifetime of fear for her, all breaking at once. It was tender, yes, but it was also trembling with a desperate, starved hunger. Her cold fingers found their way into his hair, and his arm crushed her against him. It was too much. It was everything. They broke apart, gasping. They stared at each other in the darkness, their chests heaving. Shame and fear crashed over Clara. I am sorry, she stammered, scrambling away from him, pulling herself from under the blanket. I should not have. They were right. The women in town. Clara, do not, he said, his voice a raw rasp. He looked overwhelmed, his face pale. He looked, she thought, ashamed. The wind died as suddenly as it had come. A sliver of moonlight cut through the window, illuminating the dust motes in the air. The storm has passed, she said, her voice shaking. She stood, brushing hay from her clothes. We should go back. She was down the ladder and out the barn door before he could say another word. He followed her. They walked the 50 yards to the cabin in a roaring, terrible silence, the new snow crunching under their boots. The next morning, Thomas was gone before she woke. When he returned at midday, he did not look at her. He ate his meal standing, his back to her. I am riding the south fence line, he said, his voice flat. I will be back late. He left. The silence in the cabin was cold, sharp as glass. He had not just avoided her. He had erased her. He was treating her exactly as he had that first day. A problem to be solved. A stranger to be tended. The same thing happened the next day. He rose early, worked late, and spoke only in grunts. He was building a wall between them, brick by careful brick. He was polite. He was distant. He was treating her like a ghost. On the third day, Clara had had enough. She had been abandoned at the stage. She had been left to freeze. She had been beaten by her father and mocked by a town. She would not be made invisible in the one place she had felt safe. He came in for supper, his face a mask of weary indifference. He washed his hands, his back to her, and turned to get his plate. She was standing in front of it. Move, Clara, he said, his voice tired. I am hungry. No, she said, her voice shaking but clear. Not until you look at me, he sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. I do not have time for this. Look at me, she insisted. He raised his eyes. They were cold. What is it? You are treating me like a stray dog you regret feeding. You are treating me like something fragile. Like a mistake. I am not your mistake. Thomas, his face darkened. What happened in the barn? It should not have. I betrayed your trust. I took advantage. I am sorry for it. You are sorry? She repeated, her voice rising in disbelief. You are sorry? For what? For kissing me? Or for treating me like a human being for 5 minutes before you remembered I was, what, damaged goods? That is not. I am not a victim, she shouted, hitting the table with her fist. The tin plates jumped. I am tired of being treated like one. You saved me from the snow, but you are still leaving me out in the cold. You look at me, but you see a ghost. You see your wife, or you see Haskins's whore. You see anything but me. Clara, stop it! He roared, his own control snapping. He was angry at her, at himself, at the entire world. What do you want from me? You want me to be like Haskins, like the men in the saloon? I want you to see me. I am a woman. I am not just the cold thing you found. I am not your sin. I am here. Her words cut through his anger, hitting the raw, tangled core of his loneliness. He saw her, flushed and furious, her eyes blazing, her chest heaving. She was not fragile. She was fire. He moved, backing her against the rough-hewn logs of the cabin wall. He did not touch her, but he pinned her, his hands slamming against the wood on either side of her head. He was trapped. She was trapped. They were inches apart, their breathing ragged. You want me to see you? He growled. his voice thick with a desperation that matched her own. God help me, Clara, I see you. I see you every moment. When I am mending fences, when I am trying to sleep, it is all I do see. Is that what you want to hear? That I am a liar? That I want you so badly I cannot think straight? That I am no better than he is? She did not flinch. She did not look away. Her anger seemed to drain, replaced by a deep, aching vulnerability that mirrored his. I want, she gasped, a single tear breaking free, tracing a path down her cheek. I want to feel something, other than sorrow, other than fear. I am so tired of being cold. His expression shattered. The anger vanished, his own walls crumbling. He saw the truth. She was not accusing him. She was pleading with him. He lowered his forehead, resting it against hers. He shut his eyes. Then let me give you more than sorrow, he whispered. He kissed her. There was no hesitation this time, no fear, no shame. It was not a kiss of tenderness. It was a kiss of raw, desperate need. It was a dam breaking. He did not take, he devoured. And she met him with equal, startling force, her hands coming up to grip his face as if she were the one drowning and he was her only air. He growled against her mouth, his hands moving from the wall to her waist, and he lifted her. She wrapped her legs around him without a second thought. He carried her the few steps to his cot and fell onto it with her, their mouths never breaking contact. The storm that had been building for weeks, inside and outside, finally broke, as if summoned by their passion. The wind picked up, howling around the small cabin, rattling the windows with a new, fierce intensity. He pulled his shirt from her body, his rough hands catching on the buttons. She clawed at his, needing to feel his skin. This was not the clinical, desperate act of survival from the blizzard. This was not the fumbling, shame-filled kiss in the barn. This was raw, urgent, and yet, underneath it all, filled with an aching, desperate reverence. He was not taking. She was not surrendering. They were two halves of a whole. Two lonely, broken people finally finding a place to rest. They came together in a tangle of limbs and blankets, a desperate, mutual claiming. It was a collision of sorrow and desire, and for the first time in her life, Clara was not cold. The next morning, the storm outside had passed, leaving the world quiet, washed clean. Inside the cabin, the silence was different, too. Clara woke first, tangled in his arms, in his bed. She felt the solid weight of his arm over her waist, the warmth of his breath on her hair. She felt solid, rooted. He woke slowly, his eyes finding hers in the gray morning light. He did not pull away. He did not look ashamed. He just looked at her, his gaze clear. He reached up, his calloused thumb brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. Are you all right? He asked, his voice low. She nodded, a small smile touching her lips. I am. They moved through the morning chores in a new quiet. It was not the tense silence of avoidance, but the deep, comfortable quiet of a shared understanding. He poured her coffee, and his hand rested on her shoulder for a moment. She mended his shirt, and the intimacy of the act was a simple, profound fact. A few days later, she saw him outside the cabin. He was not chopping wood or tending the animals. He was driving stakes into the hard ground near the north wall, measuring distances with a length of string. She came out, pulling his old coat around her shoulders. Thomas, what are you doing? He squinted, sighting down the string, and hammered another stake. This cabin is too small, he said, not looking up. He finished his line, then finally turned to her. I am building another room. He did not say it was for her. He did not ask her to stay. He did not speak of marriage or the future. He just stated a fact. He was building. He was making space. Clara stood there, the cold wind whipping her hair, and watched him work. He was giving her more than sorrow. He was giving her a home. The sound of Thomas's hammer was the new rhythm of their life. It was a sound of purpose, of building. The new room was framed, the walls rising log by log. He was slow, meticulous, but every day it grew. It was a physical manifestation of the space he was making for, solid and real. Clara worked beside him, chinking the logs with a mixture of mud and straw. Her hands calloused, her face smudged. They were a team. The silence between them was no longer charged with tension. It was deep, comfortable, and solid, like the foundation stones he had set. They were hauling the last of the roof beams into place, their breathing synchronized, their muscles straining, when the riders appeared. 3 men, cresting the ridge. They were not cowboys. They rode with a stiff, official purpose. Clara saw them first. Her hand flew to her throat, and the log slipped from her grasp, thudding to the ground. Thomas turned, his eyes narrowing. He recognized 2 of them. Roy Haskins, sitting tall in an expensive saddle, a smug, satisfied look on his face, and beside him, wearing a tarnished badge, was Marshal Eli Davies. The 3rd man was one of Haskins's hired guns. "Thomas?" Clara whispered, her voice a thread of ice. "Go inside the cabin," he said, his voice low and flat. "No." She stood beside him, her feet planted. The men reined in their horses a few yards away, forming a half circle around the new, unfinished room. "McAllister," the marshal said, his voice heavy with reluctance. He looked at the cabin, at Clara standing by Thomas, at the new construction. His eyes were full of a weary judgment. "Marshal," Thomas replied. He did not look at Haskins. "I'm not here for pleasure. Thomas, Mr. Haskins here," he gestured, "has filed a formal complaint. He has a legal, binding mail-order contract, signed by this woman." Haskins smiled, a wet, ugly curl of his lip. "She's my property. Marshal, paid for and delivered. This man," he sneered at Thomas, "stole her, and God knows what he's been doing with her since—" "That is a lie," Clara said, her voice shaking but loud. "You keep your mouth shut, girl," Haskins snapped. Thomas took a step forward, his hands clenched. "She is not your property. Roy, she is a free woman. She is an indentured bride," Haskins shot back, pulling a folded document from his coat. "It is all right here. The law is the law. She signed it. She used my $30 for the ticket. She belongs to me, and I want her back." Marshal Davies looked at the ground, then back at Thomas. "He is right. Thomas, the contract is legal. The circuit judge won't be through for another month. But the paper is clear. She agreed to marry him. She is his intended. I have to take her." "You will not," Thomas said. It was not a plea. It was a statement of fact. His body was tense, his gaze locked on the marshal. He was calculating. 3 men. He was 1. The rifle was inside the cabin. His axe was on the ground, 2 feet from his hand. "Do not make this hard. McAllister," the marshal warned, his hand moving to rest on the butt of his pistol. "I do not want trouble, but I will uphold the law." "The law?" Thomas spat. "What kind of law leaves a woman to freeze to death and then drags her back to the man who left her?" "That is his word against hers," the marshal said, his face grim. "All I have is this paper. Now, stand aside." Haskins's hired man uncoiled a rope from his saddle. Clara looked at it, and a small, terrified sound escaped her. Thomas saw the rope. He saw Haskins's leering face, and he saw Clara. He bent, his hand moving toward the axe handle. "No!" Clara screamed. She ran and grabbed his arm, her fingers digging in. "Thomas, no! Please!" She looked at him, her eyes wide with terror. But it was not terror for herself. He saw it clearly. She was terrified for him. She knew he would fight. She knew he would die. He would kill Haskins, and the marshal would gun him down, and it would all be for nothing. She would be left alone. Again. "Clara, I will not let him take you," he rasped, his voice thick with a killing rage. "And I will not let him kill you," she sobbed, her grip tightening. "Do you see? He wins. If you fight, he wins. He gets us both." She turned from him, her shoulders straightening. She wiped the tears from her face with a muddy hand and looked at Marshal Davies. "I will go," she said. "Clara," Thomas roared. "I will go," she repeated, her voice stronger. If Mr. McAllister is guaranteed his safety, if you give your word, Marshal, that no harm will come to him, that this ends here, I will go." Haskins laughed. "You hear that? She is already negotiating." Marshal Davies looked at Clara, his expression shifting from duty to a grudging respect. He nodded. "You have my word. No harm will come to McAllister. As long as he stands down—" "It is all right. Thomas," she whispered, turning back to him. She touched his face, her hand cold. "It is the only way. For now, I will not." "Yes, you will. You will stay safe. For me." She stepped away from him, walking toward the horses, her back straight, her head high. She did not look like she was surrendering. She looked like she was making a choice. "Get on the wagon," Haskins ordered, gesturing to a small buckboard he had tied behind his horse. "You are not worthy of riding." Clara climbed into the back without a word. Haskins looked at Thomas, his eyes glinting with pure, triumphant hatred. "She will learn her lesson. McAllister, I will make sure of it." Thomas said nothing. He stood by the half-built wall, his hands clenched so hard his nails bit into his palms. He watched the wagon rattle away, kicking up dust. He watched until they were a small speck on the horizon. He stood there until the sun began to set, the chill of the evening settling over the silent, unfinished room. That night, the cabin was a tomb. The silence was not the comfortable quiet of their life together. It was the cold, heavy silence of the grave. He sat in his chair, staring at her empty mattress by the fire, the needle and thread she had been using still resting on a pair of his socks. He could not breathe. He picked up one of the socks, the small, neat stitches a testament to her presence. He had failed. He had saved her from the snow only to hand her to the wolf. He did not sleep. He sat there, the terrible cold rage building in him, solidifying from grief into something hard and sharp. He had given his word. He would not fight the marshal, but he had made a promise to her. Too, he remembered the night before they were taken. They had lain in his bed, the sound of the hammering still echoing in their muscles. She had been tracing the line of his jaw in the dark. "I found my home in you, Thomas," she had whispered, her voice thick. "I did not know what it felt like. To be safe, to be home. It is not this cabin. It is not this land. It is you." He had held her, his heart aching with a love so fierce it terrified him. "Then I will come for you," he had promised, his voice rough. "I swear on my wife's grave, I will come for you, no matter what." Now, sitting in the cold, empty cabin, he repeated that vow. He would not break it. He would use the law. And if the law failed, he would burn the whole territory to the ground. The Haskins ranch was 10 times the size of Thomas's. The house was a large 2-story structure that aimed for grandeur but was already falling into disrepair. The paint was peeling, and the porch sagged. It was a house built on greed, not care. Roy shoved Clara inside. The interior was dark, filled with heavy, expensive furniture covered in dust. It smelled of stale whiskey and old food. "This is what you should have come to," he sneered, his hand gripping her arm. "The best house in the valley. But you preferred that widower's shack. You preferred his bed, did not you?" "Let go of me," she said, trying to pull away. He slapped her. The blow was sudden and brutal, snapping her head to the side, splitting her lip. She fell against a table, knocking a stack of papers to the floor. "You are my property now," he breathed, his face purple, his eyes bulging. "And you will learn respect." He dragged her up the stairs to a small, cold attic room. It contained nothing but a thin straw mattress and a bucket. "This is where his whores stay. You will cook and you will clean, and you will not speak unless I speak to you. And every night, you will remember who you belong to." He locked the door. The next 2 weeks were a living hell. He did not treat her as a wife. He treated her as a slave, and as a target for the rage he felt toward Thomas. He beat her for burning the coffee. He beat her for looking out the window. He called her names. his voice a constant, drunken tirade of filth. Clara's body grew thin and bruised, but her spirit, the one that had walked 7 miles in a blizzard, did not break. It hardened. She endured. She did as she was told, her face a mask of obedience, her mind cold and sharp. On the 3rd day, while she was in the kitchen, forced to cut vegetables for a stew for his hired hands, she saw a small, sharp paring knife. Her eyes darted to Haskins, who was drinking at the table. His head nodded, quick as a snake. She slipped the knife into the waistband of her skirt, covering it with her apron. Back in her locked room, she knelt by the cot. She worked a loose floorboard beneath it, her fingers raw, until it came free. She slipped the knife into the dark, hollow space beneath. It was not for him. It was for her. It was her final choice. She found a piece of charcoal and, on the wall inside the small closet, she made a mark. One day, the next day, she made another. She counted the days, hoarding her strength, waiting. Thomas, meanwhile, was a man possessed. He rode into 3 Forks, his face like a thundercloud. He did not go to the saloon with his gun. He went to the preacher. Preacher Allen was a good man, but a cautious one. He met Thomas in his small, book-lined study. "Thomas, I heard what happened," he said, wringing his hands. "It is a terrible thing, but the law, the contract." "The law is wrong," Thomas said, his voice flat, "and I need your help to fight it. That woman, Clara, she sat in this town, abandoned. Mrs. Davies, your own wife. She crossed the street to avoid her. This town failed her. You failed her. I need you to fix it." The preacher paled, the accusation hitting its mark. "What can I do? Haskins is a powerful man." "He is a brute, and brutes leave tracks. I need testimony. I need to know every bad thing he has done. The circuit judge, Miller, will be here in 2 weeks. I am petitioning him for a hearing. I need more than just my word." Preacher Allen, driven by a deep, simmering guilt, finally nodded. I will speak to people. There are stories, many stories." Thomas left the church and went to the general store. Silas Croft saw him and immediately busied himself in the back room. But his wife, Eleanor Croft, met him at the counter. She had been there the day Thomas had punched Haskins. "Mr. McAllister," she said, her voice low, "I am so sorry. For what Silas said, for all of it." "I do not need apologies. Mrs. Croft, I need help." She looked around. The store was empty. Roy Haskins. He beat one of his hired hands, a young man named Abe, half to death last spring, said he spooked a horse. Abe left the territory, but his brother, Samuel, works at the livery. He hates Roy. "Talk to him." Thomas nodded. "Thank you. And Thomas," she added, "check the county records. The man spends money like water. I would be shocked if he was right with the tax man." For 2 weeks, Thomas worked. He tracked down Samuel at the livery, who, after much convincing, agreed to testify about his brother's injuries. He spent a day at the county office and found what Eleanor Croft had suspected. Roy Haskins had not paid his property taxes in 2 years. He owed the territory nearly $800. He gathered his evidence. The preacher had 3 sworn statements from men Haskins had threatened or cheated in business. It was not much, but it was a picture. It was the truth. He filed his petition. Judge Abram Miller, a hard man known for following the letter of the law but hating bullies, read it. He set a date, the day of the hearing. The town hall was packed. It was not a real courtroom, just a large room with benches and a raised platform. Every person from town was there. It was the middle of the day, but the saloon was empty. Thomas stood at the front, his hands clasped behind his back. He was clean-shaven, wearing his one good shirt. He looked like a soldier awaiting inspection. Roy Haskins sat at a table to the left, a slick-looking lawyer from Helena beside him. Haskins looked bored, as if this were a waste of his time. The door at the back opened. The crowd went silent. Marshal Davies walked in, his face grim. Behind him was Clara. A collective gasp went through the room. She was wearing the same mended traveling dress, but it was torn at the shoulder. She was impossibly thin, her skin a pale, translucent gray, and on her face, stark and ugly, was a deep purple bruise on her left cheek and a yellowish, fading one over her right eye. She did not look at the crowd. She did not look at Haskins. She walked, limping slightly, down the aisle. Her head was held high. Her eyes found Thomas, and she gave him a look of such profound, exhausted strength that his heart nearly broke. She sat on the bench he had saved for him. Judge Miller banged his gavel. "This court is in session. I have a petition from Mr. Thomas McAllister challenging the validity of a marriage contract held by Mr. Roy Haskins, Mr. Haskins's lawyer. You may begin." The lawyer stood. He was smooth. "Your Honor, this is a simple matter of property and contract law. My client, Mr. Haskins, entered into a legal agreement. He provided $30 for passage. The woman, Clara, used that passage. She is his legal, intended bride. She absconded with this man, Mr. McAllister, and is now refusing to honor her agreement. We ask the court to enforce the contract and return the woman to Mr. Haskins's custody." The judge nodded, looking at the papers. "It seems straightforward." "Your Honor," Thomas said, standing. He had no lawyer. "May I speak?" "You may, Mr. McAllister." "The agreement was for a marriage," Thomas said, his voice clear and steady. "A partnership, not slavery. Mr. Haskins failed to meet his side of the bargain. He left her at the stage in Three Forks. He let her walk 7 miles in a blizzard. He left her to die at his own fence line. I found her half dead. That is when the contract was broken." Haskins's lawyer jumped up. "Objection! These are unproven accusations." "Are they?" Thomas asked, turning to the crowd. "Silas Croft, did she not wait in your store for 7 hours? Did you not tell her it was suicide to walk?" Silas Croft, sitting in the back, turned red. The judge stared at him. "Mr. Croft?" Silas swallowed. Yes, she waited. All day. He never came." The crowd murmured. Haskins's lawyer sat down. Scowling, Thomas pressed on. He called Samuel from the livery, who testified about his brother's beating. He presented the tax records. "This is not a man who honors his agreements, Your Honor. Not to his employees, not to the territory, and not to her." The judge looked at the tax records. His brow furrowed. "This is a poor reflection on your character, Mr. Haskins, but it does not invalidate the contract." He looked at Thomas. "Do you have anything else?" Thomas's shoulders slumped. He had failed. The law was just paper. "Your Honor." The voice was quiet, but it cut through the room. Clara was standing. She held the back of the bench, her knuckles white, but she did not tremble. "May I speak?" she asked. The judge looked at her, his hard eyes softening as he took in her bruised face. "Please, miss, come forward." Clara walked to the front. She stood before the judge, not as a victim, but as a witness. "My name is Clara," she said. "I came from Pennsylvania. I had no one. I signed that paper. I thought it was for a new life. I thought it was for a home." She told her story. She spoke of waiting in the store. She spoke of the cold, and the walk, and the snow. She spoke of falling, and the feeling of the ice in her lungs. "I was dying," she said, her voice clear. "I was dying on his land. He was not busy. He was in town, in the saloon. I was told later he was playing cards. He did not forget. He did not care." She turned, her gaze sweeping over the crowd, over Thomas, and finally landing on Roy Haskins. Haskins looked away, his face red. "I was taken to Mr. Haskins' house 2 weeks ago by the marshal. You call this a marriage contract. He calls me his property. He has locked me in a room. He has beaten me." She pointed to her face. "He did this, and this, because I did not warm his coffee to his liking." The room erupted. Women gasped. Men swore under their breath. "Silence!" the judge bellowed. Clara turned back to him. "Your Honor, that contract was for a marriage. A marriage is built by 2 people, not 1. I kept my end. I traveled 2,000 miles. I waited. He did not. He broke the agreement when he left me at that stage. He voided it when he left me to die in the snow." She took a deep breath, her voice ringing with a power no one in that room had ever heard from her. "No man who leaves a woman to die in the snow has any claim to her soul." She finished. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. It was the silence of truth. Judge Miller stared at her for a long time. He looked at the contract in his hand. He looked at Roy Haskins, who was now sweating. He looked at Thomas, whose face was a mask of agonized pride. He raised his gavel and brought it down with a crack that made the whole room jump. "This court finds that the contract, legal or not, was broken. It was broken by gross, willful neglect on the part of Mr. Roy Haskins. His failure to retrieve his intended constitutes a fundamental breach of the agreement." He glared at Haskins. "This court nullifies the mail order agreement. The woman, Clara, is free of any and all obligation. She is her own person, free to go where she pleases." He banged the gavel again. "This hearing is over." Clara sagged, her legs giving out. Thomas was there in an instant, catching her, holding her up. The room exploded into noise. "This is not over! McAllister!" Roy Haskins roared, shoving his chair back. He was shaking with rage. His lawyer tried to calm him, but Roy shoved him aside. Thomas held Clara, shielding her with his body, and began to walk her down the aisle, toward the door, toward the light. As they passed Haskins' table, Roy turned and spat. The wad of tobacco and phlegm hit the dusty floorboards, inches from Clara's feet. Thomas stopped. The rage he had held back for 2 weeks detonated. He let go of Clara and lunged at Haskins, his fist drawn back, ready to finish what he had started in the general store. "Thomas!" Clara's hand shot out and grabbed his arm. Her grip was like steel. He froze, his arm trembling. "No," she whispered, her voice firm. "Please, he is not worth it. We are leaving." He looked at her bruised, beautiful, strong face. She was right. The fight was over. She had won it. She had won it with words, not fists. He slowly, agonizingly, lowered his arm. He put it around her instead, pulling her tight to his side. He gave Haskins one last look of pure, cold contempt. They walked out of the town hall, the crowd parting for them. They stepped out onto the boardwalk, into the bright, sharp sunlight. It was cold. Thomas stopped. He shrugged out of his own heavy wool coat, the one he had worn that first day he had found her, gently, with a reverence that made several women in the crowd weep. He placed it around her small, bruised shoulders. She leaned her head against his chest, her eyes closing for just a second. He held her, and together they walked toward the wagon. The ride back to the ranch was a long 8 miles of silence. It was not the comfortable quiet they had built, nor the charged, breathless silence of their first near kiss. It was the heavy, exhausted quiet of a battlefield after the fight is over. Thomas kept glancing at Clara. She sat beside him on the wagon bench, wrapped in his heavy coat, her small, bandaged hands resting in her lap. She looked straight ahead, her face pale, the bruises stark in the harsh daylight. She looked, he thought, like a porcelain doll that had been dropped and glued back together, the cracks still visible. He had won. She was free. But he felt no triumph. He felt only a cold, protective rage and a deep, gnawing fear. The woman he had won back was not the same one he had lost 2 weeks prior. When they reached the cabin, she slid down from the wagon before he could help her. She walked inside, her movements stiff. The new, unfinished room stood beside the cabin, a monument to the life they had just started, a life that already felt like a distant memory. Thomas unhitched Gideon, his motions mechanical. He rubbed the horse's nose, his heart aching. He had wanted to kill Haskins. He still wanted to kill him. The image of Clara's bruised face was a hot brand in his mind, but she had stopped him. Her grip on his arm had been desperate, but not weak. It had been a command. He entered the cabin. She was standing at the wash basin, his coat pooled at her feet. She was pumping water, her movements jerky from the pain in her bruised ribs. She washed her face, scrubbing at her skin as if trying to remove a stain. She looked at her reflection in the small, cracked piece of mirror he had nailed to the wall. She stared at the bruises, her expression not one of self-pity, but of cold, hard assessment. She touched the split on her lip, her eyes analytical. "Clara," he said, his voice rough. She met his gaze in the mirror. "I am all right. Thomas—" But she was not. She was harder. The softness he had seen in the hayloft, the vulnerable woman who had wept in his arms, was gone. She was still polite. She was still quiet. But the quiet was no longer a refuge. It was a fortress. She had been to war, and she had returned with armor. That night, he put new blankets on his bed, the one in the main cabin. "You should rest here," he said. "No," she said, her voice flat. She retrieved her old mattress from the corner where he had stored it and placed it back by the hearth. "That is my place." He did not argue. He saw the truth. The bed was where they had been together. It was a place of intimacy, of vulnerability. She was not ready for that. She was not ready to be soft. He took a blanket and went to sleep in his chair, as he had the first night he found her. They were back at the beginning. Thomas gave her space. He did not know what else to do. He could fight a man, but he could not fight a memory. He returned to his work, the steady, rhythmic sound of his hammer on the new room filling the silence. He was building, because it was the only thing he knew how to do. Clara did not rest. She began to work with a quiet, desperate ferocity. She cleaned the cabin, scrubbing the floorboards until the pine was pale. She mended every piece of clothing they owned, her stitches tiny and precise, as if she were stitching her own world back together. One day, Thomas returned from checking the fence line to find her sitting on the porch, his sharpest hunting knife in her hand. His heart stopped. He thought. He did not know what he thought, but she was not harming herself. She was carving a piece of scrap pine. He watched her from a distance. Her hands, still tender from her time at Haskins's, were steady. She was carving a spoon. Her movements were not artistic. They were deliberate, forceful. She was shaving away the wood, her face a mask of concentration. She was imposing her will on something, making it useful. Over the next week, she carved 3 spoons, a small bowl, and a new handle for the skillet. She was shaping her home, replacing the things they had lost, proving that she could make what she needed. When the weather turned warmer, she began to walk the ridge behind the cabin. He saw her digging, her back straight. She returned with clumps of earth, which she planted near the cabin door. She had found wild lupine and Indian paintbrush. She hauled water, her bruised body aching, and she watered them. She was forcing life to grow. Thomas watched her, his heart heavy with a love so deep it hurt. He saw what she was doing. She was not just healing. She was reclaiming. She was taking the ground they had won and making it a home, piece by painful piece. One evening, the new room was finished. The roof was on. The floorboards laid. It was just an empty box, smelling of fresh-cut pine, but it was theirs. They sat at the small table, eating the stew she had made. The silence had eased over the weeks. It was becoming theirs again. He put his spoon down. "I will build a bed frame for the new room tomorrow," he said. "It is bigger. It will be ours. And I will move your mattress out." She stopped eating, her spoon halfway to her mouth. She looked at him, her eyes searching his. "I should go into town," he continued, his voice low, his knuckles white on the table. "I should speak to Preacher Allen about a proper wedding." Her hand trembled. "Just once." "A wedding," she repeated. "We are living as man and wife. Clara, you are a free woman. I want you to be my wife, properly, legally, so no man can ever question it again." She looked down at her plate. He expected a smile, perhaps tears. Instead, she was silent for a full minute. When she looked up, her eyes were filled with the old, deep shadow of fear. "And then we are safe?" she whispered. "A piece of paper from the preacher, a ring. It stops men like Roy Haskins. It stops the cold. It stops the fire." He did not understand. "What if peace does not last, Thomas?" she asked. her voice aching with a world weariness that did not belong in one so young. "What if we build this life, and it is just a short, warm day before another blizzard? I do not know if I can survive another one." He looked at her, at the woman who had faced death, shame, and violence, and was now more afraid of peace than she was of war. Because peace could be taken away. He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. Her skin was calloused now, rough from carving, from planting. "Then we will build it again," he said, his voice a vow. "If he burns it, we build it again. If the snow comes, I will find you. If the world tries to tear it down, Clara, we will stand on the wreckage and we will build it again and again, as many times as it takes." She stared at him, the fear in her eyes slowly receding, replaced by the steady, hardened resolve he had come to know. She turned her hand over and gripped his, not softly, but with the strength of a survivor. It was not a promise of happiness. It was a pact of endurance. Their next trip to town was different. As they walked toward the general store, Mrs. Davies, the preacher's wife, who had once crossed the street to avoid Clara, stopped. She looked at Clara's faded bruises, at her plain dress, and she nodded. It was a stiff, respectful acknowledgement. Inside the store, Eleanor Croft came from behind the counter. She pressed a small cloth sack into Clara's hands. "It is sugar," she whispered, her eyes kind. I heard you were building on. Consider it a housewarming. For what you did, for speaking up." Clara accepted it, her throat tight, but the peace was fragile. The tension in the town had not vanished. It had merely shifted. As they loaded their supplies, 3 men came out of the saloon. They did not Their eyes were on Clara. It was not the leering gaze she had first received. It was something different. It was a mixture of envy, directed at Thomas, and a deep, simmering resentment, directed at her. She had defied a man. She had defied a contract. She had stood in a room full of men and won. She was a dangerous woman. She had upset the order of things. Thomas felt their stares. He placed his hand on the wagon bed, close to Clara's back. "It is time to go," he said. They were an island. The town had sided with them against Haskins, but it had not welcomed them. They were, and would remain, outsiders. The fire started 3 weeks later. They were asleep in the new room, in the bed he had built for them. The peace had been so deep, so quiet, that the disruption was all the more violent. It was the smell that woke Thomas, acrid smoke, and something else. Kerosene. He was out of the bed in an instant, pulling on his trousers. "Clara, wake up! Fire!" He slammed the door open. The main cabin was clear, but the night air outside was a hellish, roaring orange. "The barn!" he choked. He ran out, barefoot, into the yard. The barn was fully engulfed, flames licking 100 feet into the night sky. So bright it looked like day, and it was spreading. The dry grass between the barn and the cabin was catching, a line of fire snakes slithering toward their home. "The animals!" Clara screamed. Right behind him, she was carrying the water buckets. "Gideon!" Thomas roared. He ran to the barn doors, the heat so intense it seared his eyebrows. He kicked the doors open. The horse was inside, screaming, a high-pitched sound of pure terror. "Get the water on the cabin wall," Thomas yelled at Clara. "The roof! Soak the roof!" He wrapped his arm in a wet blanket from the line and plunged into the inferno. He found Gideon, swatting at the sparks on his mane, and dragged the terrified animal out, cutting him loose. The mare, June, followed, her eyes rolling. He turned back. Clara was not on the roof. She was on the ground, a frantic, desperate figure, running back and forth from the well, throwing buckets of water on the cabin wall, beating at the burning grass with a saturated horse blanket. "It is catching the woodpile!" she screamed. He joined her. They were a frantic, 2-person army against a roaring monster. The heat was unbearable. The smoke was a thick, choking blanket. They did not speak, just moved, hauling water, beating, soaking. A section of the barn roof collapsed in a geyser of sparks. One landed on the new roof of their room. "Thomas!" He scrambled up the side, using the log ends as handholds, and beat the spark out with his bare hands, yelping in pain. Clara was below him, fighting the fire on the ground. A gust of wind suddenly shifted the flames, blowing a sheet of fire from the barn directly at her. It caught the hem of her nightgown. She screamed. Thomas leaped from the roof, tackling her to the ground, rolling her in the dirt, smothering the flames with his own body. She was coughing, gasping, her hands held up. They were bright red, blistered. She had been using the wet blanket to beat the flames, and the heat had cooked her hands. "It is no use," Thomas choked, pulling her back. "The cabin, it is going to go." But the wind shifted again, pulling the main blaze back toward the ruins of the barn. The line of fire in the grass sputtered, dying against the patch of dark, damp earth Clara had been tending. Her garden, the wet soil of her transplanted flowers, had acted as a firebreak. They stood, clinging to each other, covered in soot, breathing the acrid air. The barn was gone. It was a smoking, glowing skeleton. But the cabin and the new room stood, scarred, blackened, but standing. They sank to the ground, exhausted, shaking. Clara cradled her hands, weeping in silent, shuddering gasps. Not from fear, but from the agonizing pain. As dawn broke, Thomas walked the perimeter. The air was thick with the stench of ash and despair. He found the footprints first, leading from the road, behind the woodpile. They were from a large boot, a boot he recognized. Then, tucked behind the collapsed water trough, he found it, a tin of kerosene, tipped on its side, the cap missing. It was not his. He stood, his face black, his eyes red. The cold, murderous rage he had suppressed in the courtroom returned, 100 times stronger. This was not just a threat, this was an attempt on their lives. He walked into the cabin. Clara was sitting at the table, her hands wrapped in wet rags, her face pale. He said nothing. He went to the wall and took down his rifle. He checked the chamber. "Thomas." He did not look at her. He strode to the door. "Thomas, no." She was standing in his way, her small, bandaged hands held up. "You cannot," she whispered. "He burned our home, Clara." "He tried to kill us. He tried to burn you alive. Get out of my way." "No!" Her voice was steel. "This is what he wants. Can you not see? He failed in the court. Now he wants you. He wants you to ride onto his land, angry, with a gun. He will be waiting. He will shoot you down, and the law will say he was defending his home. He will win. He will take everything from us, and he will be right in the eyes of the law. He has to be stopped," he roared, the pain and fury breaking. "Not like this," she pleaded, tears streaming down her soot-stained face. "Please, do not let him make you a killer. Do not let him turn you into him. We have the cabin. We are alive. That means we have already won. Please, do not leave me." He looked at her, at this small, indomitable woman. Her hands burned from protecting his home, her body blocking him from throwing his life away. She was right. This was a trap. Haskins was not just a brute. He was a coward, and this was a coward's move. The rage did not leave him, but it solidified, turning from a hot fire to a cold, hard stone in his gut. He slowly, agonizingly, lowered the rifle. He leaned it against the wall. He reached out and touched her cheek with his soot-covered fingers, his hand shaking. "He burned your hands. You said we would build it again," she whispered. "This is again, but we build it together, not apart." The ranch was uninhabitable. The air was foul, the water from the well tainted with ash. The loss of the barn, their tools, and the winter hay was a devastating blow. "We cannot stay here," Thomas said 2 days later. "The smell was making them sick. We need to let the air clear, let the ground heal." "Where will we go?" Clara asked. The town was not an option. "The high country," he said, looking west toward the mountains. "The air is clean up there. We can hunt. We will take the horses and enough supplies for a week. We need to breathe." They packed what little they had. Gideon and June had survived. their coats singed but their spirits unbroken. They rode out, leaving the blackened, smoking ruins of their new life behind them. The higher they climbed, the cleaner the air became. The smell of ash gave way to the sharp, clean scent of pine and melting snow. They rode into a high meadow, a bowl of green surrounded by peaks, a small, clear stream cutting through it. It was as if the fire had never happened. The world was pristine. They made camp. He taught her how to set a snare, and she caught a rabbit. He showed her which roots were good to eat. They were surviving, just the two of them, with nothing but the horses and what they carried. That night, he built a small, contained fire. The stars overhead were not the smoky, dim stars of the ranch. They were sharp, cold diamonds, scattered so thickly it looked as if the sky was full of holes. They sat, wrapped in the same blanket, watching the flames. This fire was not a monster. It was a comfort. It was warmth. "It is so quiet," she whispered. He said nothing, just pulled her closer. The trauma of the last few weeks, the fire, the fear, began to reclog. Here, they were safe. Here, there was no Haskins, no town, no judgment. She turned to him, her face illuminated by the soft firelight. She touched his face, her bandaged fingers gentle. He kissed her. It was not the desperate, frantic passion of their first time. It was not the hungry kiss in the barn. It was slow and deep and healing. It was a deliberate, quiet reclaiming of what the fire had tried to take. They made love under the vast, starry sky, beside the safety of their small fire. It was an act of defiance, a statement that they were still alive, and they were still together. Afterward, they lay tangled in the blanket, watching the embers glow. Clara was nestled in his arms, her head on his chest. "You saved me," she whispered into the darkness. She was not talking about the fire. She was talking about everything, the snow, the courtroom, her life. Thomas lay on his back, staring up at the river of stars. He thought of the woman he had pulled from the snow, a half-frozen, terrified girl. He thought of the woman who had stood in court, her voice clear and strong. He thought of the woman who had fought the fire, her hands burning, and the woman who had stood between him and his own damnation. "No," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You walked back into the fire for me?" She lifted her head, confused. "In the town hall," he clarified. "When you stood up, you were free. You could have run, but you stayed, and you fought." He tightened his grip on her. "At the barn, you could have saved yourself. You stayed, and you fought. When I had the rifle, you could have let me go. You stayed, and you saved my soul." He looked down at her, his eyes clear in the starlight. "We saved each other. Clara, you are the one who chose to live." They returned to the ranch, but the ranch was gone. The air was a toxic, gray haze, the smell of ash and kerosene and wet. Burned death was everywhere. The cabin stood, a scarred and blackened thing. But the barn was a pile of glowing cinders. Their hay, their tools, their food stores, all gone. Clara stood in the middle of the yard, her bandaged hands held uselessly at her sides, and looked at the ruin. Thomas watched her, his heart a cold, hard knot. He had killed men for less. He had gone to war for less. "We will clean it," she said, her voice a dry rasp. "Not yet," he said. "The water is bad. The air is poison." He looked at her, at the dark circles under her eyes, at the stubborn set of her jaw. "We need to leave, just for a while." They rode out, taking only the 2 horses that had survived the inferno, a rifle, and what little food had been saved inside the cabin. They rode west, up into the high meadows, just as they had done before. But this time it was not a journey of healing. It was an escape. They found their meadow, the one by the stream, and they made camp. For a week, they said very little. They hunted, they slept. They let the clean, cold mountain air scour the smoke from their lungs. They were alive. They were together. It was the only victory they had. It was on the 8th morning that Clara, returning from the stream, suddenly stopped, her hand flying to her stomach. She dropped the water bucket and bent over, a wave of sickness racking her body. Thomas was at her side in an instant, his face tight with concern. "Clara, was it the water?" She shook her head, wiping her mouth, her face pale. She looked up at him, and her eyes were not filled with sickness. They were filled with a dawning, terrifying recognition. When did the fire happen?" she whispered. 3 weeks ago." "Why?" "My courses," she said, her hand still pressed against her abdomen. "They have not come. Not since before we left." Thomas stared at her. He did not understand. She looked at him, her eyes wide, and he saw the same terror he had seen the day he pulled her from the snow. "Thomas," she said, her voice breaking, "I felt this before. In Pennsylvania. I am with child." The words hit him like a physical blow. A child. He looked at her, at their meager camp, at the world that had just tried to burn them alive. He thought of the ruin waiting for them back at the ranch. He thought of Roy Haskins, still out there, a shadow, a threat. And then his mind went further back, to the floor of the cabin, to the smell of blood, to his wife Sarah, her face pale, her life seeping away. He felt not joy, but a profound, paralyzing terror. Clara saw it in his face. She saw his fear, and it mirrored her own. She began to cry, but they were not the tears of gratitude she had shed in his arms. They were the old tears, the tears of the cold, the tears of loss. "I cannot," she wept, sinking to the ground. "I cannot. Not again. I buried one. In the cold. He was so silent. I cannot do it again. Thomas, not in this place. It is too hard. It takes everything." He knelt in front of her, his own fear a cold stone in his gut. He had no words. He had no comfort. He had just seen their life burn to the ground. "I'm afraid, too," he admitted, his voice a raw whisper. He touched her face, his calloused thumb wiping a tear. "I am so afraid. When I think of Sarah, of the snow." They held each other in the high, lonely meadow, two souls terrified of the one thing that should have been a gift. But as he held her, the fear began to recede, replaced by the familiar, stubborn rage that had kept him alive. This was not Pennsylvania. She was not a shamed girl in an attic. And he was not the helpless husband watching his wife die. He pulled back, gripping her shoulders. "Listen to me. This is not before. You are not alone. That monster back east. He is gone. Your father is gone. This child. This is our child. This is not a secret. This is a promise." She looked at him, her sobs hitching. "We will rebuild the barn," he said, his voice fierce. "We will dig a new well. We will build a wall around this ranch if we have to. You will not be cold, and it will not be silent. I swear it to you. Clara." Her weeping softened. She leaned into him, her fear slowly giving way. This was Thomas, the man who had pulled her from the death, the man who had faced down a courtroom, the man who had walked through fire for her. She touched her stomach. "A gift," she whispered, testing the word. "After all the loss, it feels like a gift." They returned to the ranch a week later. The smell of ash was gone, washed away by a hard spring rain. The earth was black, but it was clean. They started to work. Word of the fire had reached town. The story of Haskins' kerosene tin had been told by the liverymen, who had seen him fill it. The town, which had held them at arm's length, finally chose a side. One afternoon, Preacher Allen rode out, his wagon loaded with lumber. "A gift," he said, his face ashamed. "From the congregation. We have not been good neighbors, Mr. McAllister." A few days later, Eleanor Croft arrived with 2 hens and a sack of seed. They rebuilt. They worked from sunup to sundown. Thomas and the preacher, and even Samuel from the livery, raised the new barn. It was smaller, but it was sturdy. Clara, her hands healed, planted her garden in the rich, newly fertile ash. Life, stubborn and defiant, was returning. Summer came, hot and dry. Clara's belly grew high and full. A deep, quiet peace settled over the ranch. Thomas would sit on the porch, watching her weed her garden, and a feeling he had not thought possible, a simple, uncomplicated happiness, would fill his chest. He was building a home. He was going to be a father. The peace was shattered on a Tuesday in August. Thomas was on the roof of the new barn, nailing the last of the shingles. Clara was in the cabin, baking. It was hot, the air still and heavy. He heard a horse. He looked up, expecting the preacher. It was Roy Haskins. He was not the man from the courtroom. He was not the man who had burned their barn. This was a different man. He was skeletal. His expensive clothes were in rags. His hair matted. His eyes yellowed and shot with red. He was riding a horse that looked as broken as he did. He was drunk, a bottle clutched in one hand, but in the other, he held a revolver. "McAllister!" he roared, his voice a wet croak. He reined the horse in, swaying in the saddle. Thomas slid down the ladder, his heart hammering. "Clara!" he yelled. "Stay inside! Bolt the door!" He landed on the ground, his axe handle just feet away. "You!" Haskins spat, his eyes wild. He was so drunk he could barely focus. "You took it all. You took her. You took my name. The taxmen. They took my land. All of it. Because of you. It is over, Roy," Thomas said, his voice low, his eyes on the gun. "Right away. It is over when I say it is over," Haskins screamed. He raised the revolver, but his hand was shaking so badly he could not aim. He tried to dismount and fell, tumbling into the dirt. The gun clattered on the stones. Thomas did not move. Haskins, enraged, scrambled for the gun. Thomas was faster. He kicked it away, sending it spinning into the grass. Haskins roared, a wordless sound of pure animal fury, and lunged. He was weaker than he had been, but he was filled with a madman's strength. He tackled Thomas, and they both went down in the dirt. It was not a fight. It was a brawl. It was brutal and ugly. Haskins was all teeth and nails, trying to gouge Thomas's eyes. Thomas was pure defense, trying to subdue him. Haskins's hand fumbled at his belt and pulled a long, sharp skinning knife. He slashed upward. Thomas twisted, but the blade caught him, a long, burning gash across his forearm. The blood was immediate, hot and dark. The sight of his own blood, the pain, and the overwhelming, primal need to protect his home, his wife, his unborn child, it all detonated. The civilized man who had stood in court vanished. The soldier returned. He hit Haskins, a hard, brutal blow to the jaw. He hit him again. He grabbed the hand holding the knife and slammed it against a rock until he heard a snap, and the knife fell. Haskins screamed, but Thomas was beyond hearing. He straddled the man, his hands finding his throat. He saw the fire. He saw Clara's burned hands. He saw the knife. He saw a future of always looking over his shoulder. He squeezed. Haskins' face turned purple, his eyes bulging, his feet drumming uselessly on the ground. Thomas was going to kill him. He was going to end this right here, in the dirt, and bury the problem. Click! It was the loudest sound in the world. The sharp, double click of a shotgun hammer being pulled back. "Thomas!" Her voice was like ice water. He paused, his grip still tight. He looked up, his vision blurred with red rage. Clara was standing on the porch, his shotgun in her hands. She was not aiming it. She was just holding it. Her face was pale, her pregnant belly a stark curve against the cabin door. "Let him go," she said. "He tried to kill me." Thomas gasped, the blood dripping from his arm. "He tried to kill us. It has to end." "It will end," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "But not like this. Not with you becoming him. Let him go. Thomas, please. For me. For us." He looked down at the pathetic, choking man beneath him. He looked at his own hands, his bloody arm. He looked at his wife, standing watch, protecting his soul, with a final guttural roar of despair. He released his grip and rolled off. Haskins lay on the ground, gasping, coughing, sobbing like a child. He was beaten, utterly, Clara walked down the porch steps, the heavy shotgun never wavering. She did not look at Thomas. She stood over Roy Haskins. Haskins looked up. He saw the muzzle of the gun. He saw her face, the faded scars of the bruises he had given her. He saw her belly. He flinched, bracing for the blast. He knew he deserved it. Clara looked down at the man who had ordered her, abandoned her, beaten her, and tried to burn her alive. She had every right. The law would have called it self-defense. She held the gun on him for a long, silent moment. The only sound was his pathetic, broken weeping. Then she lowered the gun. "This is what strength looks like, Mr. Haskins," she said, her voice clear and cold. "It is not this." She gestured to his knife. His gun. "It is not the fire. It is not your fists. Strength is having every reason to kill, and choosing to walk away." She uncocked the hammers. "Get up." Haskins stared at her, uncomprehending. He had been beaten by the man, but he had just been annihilated by the woman. "Get up," she repeated. "Take your horse and ride. If you ever come back here, if I ever see your face in this valley again, I will not stop him, and I will not miss." Roy Haskins scrambled to his feet. He was a broken, weeping, bloody mess. He stumbled to his horse, hauled himself into the saddle, and rode away. He did not look back. They watched him go, a small, pathetic figure disappearing over the ridge. They never saw him again. They heard, months later, that he had been found frozen in a ditch near the Canadian border, a bottle of whiskey clutched in his hand. Thomas stood in the yard, his arm bleeding. Clara set the shotgun down and went to him. She said nothing. She just took his bloody arm and led him inside to be mended. The war was finally over. Months passed. The autumn was rich, the harvest good. The new barn was full. The cabin was warm. The peace was real. The snows came, and with the first deep blizzard of December, Clara's time came. The wind howled, a high-pitched, lonely scream. It was the same sound, the same wind that had buried her, the same wind that had been screaming when Sarah died. Clara cried out, her hands gripping the posts of the bed he had built. "It is just like before," she wept, her face pale with sweat and fear. "The sound! I am so cold!" Thomas was terrified. His hands were shaking. The ghosts were in the room. He could see Sarah on the floor. He could hear Clara's story of the silent, cold baby. But he grabbed the fear and forced it down. He was not that man. She was not that girl. He bathed her face with a warm cloth. He held her hands. "I am here," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble against the storm. "You are not cold. I am here. You are not alone. Clara, breathe with me." It was a long night. It was a hard fight. She screamed. He prayed. The storm raged outside, but inside, the fire roared in the hearth. He held her. He did not leave. Just before dawn, the labor peaked. She gave one final, desperate cry, a sound that tore from her soul. And then, silence. The wind died outside, as if holding its breath. Clara lay back, gasping. Thomas's heart stopped. Silent. The word echoed in his mind. "Oh, God, no, not silent." And then a small, indignant, furious wail cut through the silence. It was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. It was the sound of life. Clara sobbed. A profound, shuddering release. Thomas, his hands shaking so badly he could barely function, cut the cord. He lifted the child. It was small, red, and impossibly perfect. "It is a daughter, Clara," he choked out. "A daughter!" He wrapped her in a clean blanket and placed her in Clara's arms. Clara wept, kissing the baby's head, her face transformed. Thomas sank to his knees beside the bed. He looked at his wife, at his daughter, and the dam of 10 years of guilt, of grief for Sarah, of the crushing weight of the son he had held for only an hour, finally broke. He put his head on the mattress, his hand next to his daughter's, and he wept. He wept for everything he had lost, and for everything, impossibly, he had been given. They named her Hannah. Their home, which had been a quiet shelter, was now alive. It was filled with the sound of a baby crying, of Clara singing a soft, tuneless song, of Thomas's deep voice as he told his daughter stories. The house was filled with laughter, with firelight, and with a warmth that had nothing to do with the hearth. The next summer, the ranch was green. The flowers Clara had planted had spread, bursts of blue and red against the cabin wall. Hannah, now walking, chased the chickens in the yard, her laughter a bright, clear bell. One evening, Clara sat on the porch, reading a book of poems Eleanor Croft had given her. Thomas sat on the steps nearby, whittling a small, smooth wooden horse for Hannah. The sun was setting, painting the mountains in hues of purple and gold. Clara stopped reading. She watched her daughter toddling through the grass. She looked at Thomas, his head bent, his hands, scarred from fire and knives, now gentle and creative. "You gave me a new life, Thomas," she said, her voice quiet in the dusk. He stopped his work. He looked up at her. He saw her, not the half-dead girl in the snow, not the bruised victim, not the fierce warrior. He saw his wife. Her face was no longer pale and haunted. It was filled with a deep, quiet, and solid peace. He smiled, the lines around his eyes crinkling. "You're the one who chose to live it." Thank you for listening to this story from all of us here at From Wild West. We truly appreciate you spending your time with us. We would love to know where you are listening from. So please, drop a comment and say hello. Your thoughts mean the world to us. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more stories. And let us know what you thought of Thomas and Clara's journey in English.